So we know that we have different proteins. What we basically need to know the functions of these different proteins. So we can look at the functional classification of these proteins, meaning that we can look at the different proteins that can perform a similar role. That's what we are looking at. And we start this by looking at this scenario. So you have a young patient who has been diagnosed with sickle cell anemia. Okay, so with sickle cell anemia, the doctor has explained that it is because of because the patient has abnormal hemoglobin, and that means that that hemoglobin cannot be able to carry the respiratory gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen effectively. So, can you tell us the function of hemoglobin? What is the structure of hemoglobin? And what happens in sickle cell anemia? What happens to this hemoglobin? Why is it not carrying out its function quite properly? Does the shape of this hemoglobin actually influence its function? If yes, how? Okay, so let us look at these different proteins, including this hemoglobin. The other question that we can look at again to emphasize why proteins are very important, you have a bodybuilder who is basically recovering, and this bodybuilder is having an increased intake of foods that contain proteins to make sure that their muscles are healthy and also to improve their immunity. Can you mention one structure protein and one defensive protein? And then can you describe the role of each of these proteins? So one defensive protein and another structure protein. And what are their roles? What about an enzyme? Where does it fall under the categories of proteins? Is it a defense protein? Is it a regulatory protein? Is it a transport protein? If we talk about those different categories of proteins, what do we actually mean? And what happens if a person is deficient of these proteins? The ones that we have just mentioned above. So let's start. So proteins perform different roles, and these roles can be easily remembered if you understand the different molecules that are proteinous in the body. Okay, we have hormones, we have enzymes, we have antibodies, we have albumin, you have keratin. These are all proteins. Okay, so what roles do they actually play? And can we categorize those roles into regulatory proteins, defense proteins, structure proteins, enzymes, and things like that? Can we do that? Definitely we can do that, and that's why we have enzymes, structure proteins, transport proteins, defense proteins. So those are the four categories that we are having there. Okay, do we have others? We'll check that out. So here we are starting with enzymes. These ones have specialized roles. Enzymes speed up the rate of reactions in the body. So we often call them biological catalysts. They remain unchanged at the end of the reaction. So what they actually do is make sure that the reaction happens very fast. We have a lot of enzymes in our bodies. And if our bodies don't have certain enzymes, we are not able to carry out, our bodies cannot be able to carry out certain functions. And that's why we need all these enzymes in our bodies. We have urease, catalase, lactase, many enzymes, very many enzymes. These are just examples here. Okay, and then we have those that proteins that we call structure proteins. Strength is what we need from them. So they are tough proteins. So keratin is an example here. Keratin, elastin, and collagen, very important. Strong proteins, think about structure proteins. So keratin, where do we find it? In your hair, nails. You find it in feathers and other skin appendages. Elastin, where do we find it? In tendons and ligaments. Okay, and then collagen, where do we find it? In connective tissues and bones. So these structures need strength. They should not be easily broken, or even be torn. Okay, if you get a ligament tear, that means that was excessive force that was applied to tear the ligament. You can't be able to, for example, play football if your ligaments are weak, because how will you be able to kick, run, and do all of these different activities? Okay, so that means that these actually have to be very, very strong proteins. So that's why we term them as structural proteins. Okay, and then we move to transport proteins. In here we have a number. What do we transport? That's the first question. If you know what we transport, then that means that you'll be able to give the different examples of proteins that can. Let's split. What needs to be transported in the body? You have gases: oxygen, carbon dioxide, hemoglobin is the one that transports that. And then you have fatty acids. Okay, these one have to be transported by serum albumin. Albumin is a plasma protein. Okay, and then we have what you call lipoproteins. They transport lipids from points of absorption to where they can be utilized. Okay, and then we have channel proteins that help in transport of glucose and also some ions. Okay, so all those are actually examples of transport proteins. And then we have nutrient and protein storage. Here we are saying that these are proteins that help in storing other nutrients. So albumin, very important in storing amino acids, okay, for the developing embryo. And then casein, also found in milk, very important in providing nutrients for baby mammals. And then we have ferritin. Okay, this one stores iron in the liver. So if you want the iron in the liver is in ferritin. And then you have the proteins that we have in seeds. These ones still will be used during the process of germination. These proteins are very important. Contractile proteins. Contractile proteins. Myosin, actin. These are contractile proteins. For you to be able to move, it is those muscles. It is these muscles contracting. But the contraction of muscles actually requires these proteins. So actin and myosin are some of the contractile proteins that we have. But we also have tubulin. This one is involved in cell division. They help in pulling the chromosomes and chromatids during cell division. So these are also proteins. They are also contractile in nature. Contractile proteins, they can contract, right? That's what we are basically referring to. Defense proteins, proteins that play an important role in immunity. So here we have the antibodies. These are defensive proteins. So the antibodies, they look like they have a Y shape. As you can see there, they have the antigen binding site, and then they have this lower end, which we often term as the heavy chain. Okay, so antibodies are defensive. They help in neutralizing the disease-causing agent. And then we have fibrinogen and thrombin. These are proteins that are very important in the clotting process. If clotting does not happen, you have germs that can be able to gain entry into our bloodstream and cause diseases. So these two proteins are actually very important in the clotting process. So that's why we are terming them as defensive proteins. And then regulatory proteins, they help in regulating. What do they regulate? They can regulate, for example, the level of a particular nutrient in the body, for example, you can talk about hormones. Hormones like insulin, this is a regulatory protein. Insulin helps in regulating the amount of glucose in the body. And then we have transcription factors. These ones are found inside the cell, and they help in determining what amino acid is actually made, and consequently what type of protein will actually be made. And those are regulatory proteins. And then receptor proteins. For any response by any cell, that response has to be picked by receptors. So that means that cells have different receptors. Receptors for iron, receptors for enzymes, receptors for many things, receptors for hormones. Okay, so editor, remove the part where I talk about receptors for enzymes. Cut that out. So what we are basically saying is that enzymes, why am I repeating that? What we are basically saying is that cells have what we call receptors. These receptors are of different kinds. What is a receptor? A receptor is a protein molecule that can respond to a particular signal. So when, for example, you have a hormone like insulin, when insulin attaches to a receptor on a cell, that cell will respond. How does it respond? Of course, these receptors are different and they respond differently. But what you're basically saying that these receptors are actually made up of proteins. So you can have hormonal receptors, you can have receptors to chemical signals, you can have receptors for neurotransmitters, you can have a number of different receptors, and these are made up of proteins largely. So we go back to the question. So the first question. Hemoglobin is a transport protein because it helps in transporting gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so it is a transport protein. If the structure of this hemoglobin is changed, we'll have problems with transportation of these gases. In sickle cell anemia, for example, you have one amino acid being replaced by another, and that changes the structure of this amino acid of the hemoglobin to become sickle cell shaped. And because it is sickle shaped, it cannot carry out its function properly. And that is why the sequence of amino acids in a protein is very important, because any change can result into changes in its ability to carry out its function. Okay, other proteins that have different roles and their functions. Of course, we have defensive proteins, and we gave examples of, for example, antibodies. Okay, and then we can talk about fibrin being very important, fibrin and thrombin being very important in clotting and therefore defensive role. Those are some that we can talk about. But of course, we talked about contractile proteins, regulatory proteins, structural proteins, and then also the enzymes that we talked about. So in the second question, we're talking about muscles. Okay, with muscles, if we need to have bulky muscles, we need to take in meals that contain a lot of proteins. So these proteins will be used for bodybuilding or muscle building. So what proteins do we have that are structural, that are important for these muscles? Collagen. Okay, collagen, very, very, very important in there. And then collagen and elastin. Okay, these things very important for a bodybuilder. Okay, these are structural proteins that are very important for a bodybuilder. Okay, we know what enzymes do, and then if you have deficiency of any of the proteins that we have talked about, there will be a problem. There will be a problem. So, for example, if there is deficiency of, for example, collagen or elastin, you're going to have muscle weakness and muscle wasting. So you don't want to be in such a situation.